Good morning. Today is Friday, January 19th, 2024. I know I discussed this last night, and what I'm going to say today has a certain similarity to what we discussed last night, but I have something that I think is important to add to the discussion today that I think is appropriate to mention as we study together today. So the question that we posed and we discussed, and we've talked about it so many times, is why is it that out of all the mitzvahs in the Torah, the first mitzvah that is given to the entire Jewish people is the mitzvah HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem Rosh Chodashim, that we should organize our lives according to the lunar calendar. This is how we mark our time. This is how we count. This is how we keep track of time. That is the mitzvah in this week's Torah portion. Again, it's not the first mitzvah mentioned in the Torah at all. It's the first mitzvah given to the entire Jewish people through Moshe, commanded by God. And let's remember, while they are still slaves in Egypt. In a certain sense, this is the beginning of the process that gets concluded at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai, with God's complete revelation. But that law-giving begins with this mitzvah. So why is it this mitzvah? What I want to share with you is based on an essay by Rabbi Avigdor Nebenzahl, who is a tremendous scholar and teacher. He lives in the old city of Jerusalem. And it's based on the Siporno. Siporno is one of the classic commentaries to the Torah. And the Siporno explains that this mitzvah is intended to begin to have us appreciate time. There is a concept called Kedushat HaZman, the sanctity of time. He gives the following example. In this week's parsha, we also have the mitzvah of matzah. And the Torah says, concerning the mitzvah of matzah, making matzah, ushmartem es hamatzos. You should guard the making of matzah. You should be careful about the making of matzah. So what does that mean, to be careful about making matzah? Well, the most basic aspect of it is, we know, the Talmud explains, that you take flour and water, you mix it together, and you put it into the oven and bake it. It is essential that not as much as 18 minutes pass between the time that the water and flour are mixed and the time it goes into the oven. It's got to be less than 18 minutes. Now, if you're not in control of time, it becomes chametz. If it just sits around and you don't really care about the time, you're not watching the time, it becomes chametz. It's unusable for Pesach. And so what this mitzvah is teaching us, ushmartem es matzos, to be careful that it should get into the oven on time, the essential message that we're supposed to learn is every moment counts. And by the way, the dough doesn't require any action to become chametz. It only requires inaction, inattention, losing track of time. That's all it requires. If you mix flour and water and you lose track of time, that becomes chametz. And clearly, this is a lesson not just for Pesach, not just for matzah, but for all of life. And this is a specific teaching. I've shared this before, and it's very important to remember. I'm Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia says, Al tikra ushmartem es hamatzos. Don't read it as if it says, guard the matzos. Ella ushmartem es hamitzvos. So, again, the Rabbi Yoshia doesn't mean to suggest that you change the vowels in the Torah, God forbid. The word matzos, mem, tzadi, vav, saf, is the same letters that spell the word mitzvos, mem, tzadi, vav, saf. just depending on where you put the vowels. So what Rabbi Yoshi is saying is, as a method of interpretation, of commentary, you should see that word as a double entendre, as having a double meaning. Of course, the Torah is talking about matzah. There's no dispute about that. But we should understand that it is also teaching us a lesson about all mitzvos. And he goes on to explain, Kederach she'ein machmitzin es hamatzah, just like we don't lose track of time, which would cause the matzah to start to rise and be invalid for Pesach. Kach ein machmitzin es hamitzvah. So too we should not lose track of the opportunity to do a mitzvah. When there's an opportunity to do a mitzvah, don't wait around. Don't lose time. Lose track of time. Do it right away. Set your timer, set your watch. Look and try to do it quickly, as soon as you can, not by losing track of time. And the Torah tries so hard to teach us this by giving us so many opportunities for Kedushat HaZman, the idea that a certain moment in time has a sanctity that the moment before it did not have, and the moment after it does not have. The modulation, the changes in reality from one moment to another, even if it's not visible to the naked eye, but within the structure of mitzvos for sure, there's so many opportunities for that. In fact, the concept of Kedushat HaZman, that one moment can have a certain sanctity that is different than the nature, the character of another moment, that is much more common in Jewish law than Kedushat HaMakom, sanctity of place. We don't dwell so much on the sanctity of place. Yes, of course, the Beit HaMikdash was very holy. Yes, of course, we hold the Kotel today to be a holy place. But it's not really the most emphasized thing, not nearly as much as we emphasize the special nature of time. Why is it that this afternoon, at one moment before sunset, I can turn on a light? And one moment later, just after sunset, I'm not allowed to turn on a light. What happened? What changed? It's not even detectable. What changed? What changed is I'm supposed to recognize the nature of time. Before sunset is chol, weekday, and with sunset, with that moment, it becomes Shabbos. So don't take it for granted. Every moment is unique. Every moment has a unique character. That's why we've discussed this before within the context of prayer. There are prayers to be said in the morning and in the afternoon and in the evening. So a prayer that's said just before sunset is mincha. And then it could be the same words, the same amidah. Just after sunset, that's mariv. It's a whole different prayer, a whole different character, a whole different mood. We discussed this before. What changed? Because every moment has its own special character. And that means once a moment passes, it will never return. There's an amazing application of this. In Jewish civil law, the Talmud has many, many rules that oversee the relationship between an employer and an employee. The subject of labor relations. It's a very important, technical, detailed discussion. What's very interesting is that Jewish law generally takes a positive view to the right to strike, which is fascinating because we think of this as a modern phenomenon, but in fact the Talmud has narratives and guidelines about the right to strike, about the right of workers to stop working. It's a big discussion with lots of details to it. We'll leave it for another time. But here's just one detail. In Jewish law, you can have one of two types of employees. There's an employee, a worker, that's called a poel, and a worker that's called a kablan. Now, I'm not using those words in the modern Israeli sense. A poel is an hourly worker. I hire someone to work, and I pay them by the hour. A kablan is someone that I pay for the job. Fix this, and I'll pay you $100. Do that, I'll pay you $100, whatever it is. As opposed to, you're working for me in fixing things from 9 to 5, and on an hourly basis, this is how much I'll pay you for an hour. Says the Talmud, Poel, an hourly worker, Yachol lachzar bo afil chatzi hayom. The Poel has the right to quit any time, even in the middle of the day. A Poel can say, I'm leaving. Obviously, the worker will only take the money that they earned up until that point, and if there's some damage that's caused, of course, they're going to have to be responsible. Okay, a lot of details to it, but the basic line is, not for a kablan. If you undertook to do a job, you have to finish the job. But if you're working on an hourly basis, you have the right to say, I quit. Why in the world should that be? So the Talmud explains from a fascinating source. In the Parsha Bahar, which is talking about the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, the fact that every 7 years we're not allowed to plant in Israel, the fact that every 50 years property returns back to its original owner. We've discussed this before. The Torah says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadayhem, because the Jewish people are my servants, God says. Hotzeisi osam meretz Mitzrayim, I am the one, God says, that took them out of Egypt. Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am Hashem their God. Says the Gemara, a poel, an hourly worker, has the right to stop working even in the middle of the day because the Torah says, Avadayhem, we are servants of God. Velo avadim la'avadim, but we are not servants of God's servants. In other words, the Torah does not want us to sell our time because our time is dedicated to serving God. Now, we can choose to sell part of our time, meaning to work on an hourly basis, but we retain the right to withdraw from that because ultimately we are not servants to our employer. We are servants of God. Now, even though God does not want us to sell our time, because that must belong to us always, there's no objection to sell our products. If I have a product, I can sell it to you. If my product is fixing your stove, I can sell that product to you for a specific price. But I can't sell you my time in perpetuity. I always have the right to withdraw. The first mitzvah that is given to the Jewish people as a nation, says Rav Nebenzahl, it teaches us the importance and holiness of guarding our time. The exodus from Egypt could not have happened a moment sooner because Hashem was figuring out what he had said to Avram all those years ago, that you'll be slaves for 400 years, and Hashem was working out to the second. And that's why God tells Moshe in our Parsha that the Jewish people will go free, b'chatzi halayla, immediately, at the moment of the strike of midnight. Now you remember the famous Rashi, when Moshe repeats that, Moshe says, k'chatzi halayla, around midnight, because human beings don't always have the exact time. I mean, even in shul today, If somebody says it's time to start davening, 4 people look at their watches and their phones. They say, no, 2 more seconds. Oh, no, you're already late, 10 seconds. I mean, everyone's got a different idea about what the time is. Okay. But Hashem knows exactly. B'chatzi halayla, it was at exactly that moment. And that means that a person has to realize that their time in this world is limited. It's not infinite. The Torah says, in the same passage that I quoted to you before about Shemitah and Yovel, the Torah says, Ki gerim v'soshavim atem imadi. You are sojourners, you're foreigners, you're temporary workers here. Now, the context of that pasuk, Hashem is saying, we don't own the land. It's only God that owns the land. But Rav Nebenzahl explains that that concept has a much wider application. We're just passing through. We're here for a certain amount of time. And if we realize the finite nature of our time, then we're going to value every moment. And if we realize that our time in the world is temporary, we try to grab all the mitzvos that we can. Ushamartem es ha-mitzvos. Guard the mitzvos. Grab as many of them as you can. Don't lose track of time. Don't say to yourself, I can do that mitzvah tomorrow. Like the example we gave last night. I can put it off. I'll get to it eventually. No. That's the same process that leads flour and water to become chametz, not matzah. And the same problem, on a wider scale, applies to mitzvos in general. Don't put it off. Be responsible. Appreciate that this moment that you have, it will never come back. This moment will never come back. I've quoted before this great comment, insight of the Chofetz Chaim, Rabbi Shomer Kagan of Radin. He said, life is like a postcard. We usually begin writing in large, leisurely scrawl, but as the message begins to fill the card, and there's so much more to say, and there's so little space left, so we start to write smaller and smaller and smaller to crowd in another word, another line. And that's such an important metaphor for life. When we're young, we think we have all the time in the world. I'll get to it slowly, one day. I can take off some time. I can waste some time. It's no big deal. The older we get, the more experience we have, the more we realize how much left there is to do, is when we realize how little time there is to do it. This first mitzvah serves to set the stage for our recognition of Kedushat HaZman, the sanctity of every moment, the fact that every moment is unique, and once it passes, it will never come back. And therefore, ushamartem es ha-mitzvos. Let's guard and protect and not delay the performance of any mitzvah, because no one has any idea if we will ultimately get to it. My friends, I wish you a great day and a beautiful Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.